Before talking about texture maps, I want to give an overview of how textures are displayed in the viewports. And that's important because you can't always rely on an active shade interactive production rendering. A lot of times it's too slow for you to be able to actually do things like place a map on a surface. And you do need to rely on the textures in the viewport. Previously in the course, we saw how to change the shading modes. In each viewport label menu, if you click on the shading mode, which is currently labeled Standard, you can go in there to Materials and choose a shading mode, and this will be global for all of the scene materials. In other words, all of the materials that are applied onto objects in the scene. And these options here will not affect any material that is not applied onto an object. We've got two basic options here: shaded materials and realistic materials. Shaded is also known as basic material, and realistic is also known as advanced material. Realistic mode gives the best results. The combination of the physical material and realistic shading is the most accurate. Shaded material mode is the legacy viewport rendering mode. It's highly simplified, it's not physically accurate, and it does not fully support OSL maps, or Open Shading Language maps. If I set this to shaded materials without maps, then I disable all the texture maps in my scene. I'll go back in there again to materials. Let's try realistic materials with maps. And that's the highest level of shading. And we see we've got a much better result here. We're getting reflections from the environment. So you do want to be in realistic mode if you can, but sometimes it's going to be problematic, especially if you have a complex OSL shading network. Let's go back to shaded materials with maps. And now talk about how to control this on a per material basis. Let's open up the material editor. I've got two floor materials prepared. On the right is floor legacy, and that's the one that's currently assigned to the floor in the scene. And it only uses legacy bitmap nodes. These are the old school 3ds Max bitmaps that have been around since day one. And additionally, they're connected to some very plain vanilla map slots or parameters, such as the base color and reflection color. The other material I've got over here is much more advanced on two fronts. Number one, it's using OSL maps, and number two, it's using those OSL maps in more exotic parameters. So instead of mapping the base color here, on this floor OSL material, I'm mapping the base weight map. And I've done that to illustrate the necessity for realistic mode because shaded mode doesn't support all this stuff. In the Slate Material Editor toolbar, there is a button, Show Shaded Material in Viewport. And that button operates on individual materials or selections of materials. So for example, if I select Floor Legacy, then I can query the state of Show Shaded Material in Viewport, and it is currently enabled. And it is enabled for all new materials by default. Show Shaded Material in Viewport should really be called Show Maps in Viewport. When this button is on, that corresponds to the viewport option Shaded Materials with Maps. So when we enable this in the viewport, what we're really doing is we're enabling this button for all the materials that are applied onto objects. When Show Shaded Material in Viewport is enabled, we should see a red stripe through the material node. And that's what we're seeing now. So with Floor Legacy selected, when we turn that off, we no longer see the textures in our viewport. And unfortunately, this red stripe is still here. It was actually supposed to turn off, but it didn't in this case. So there you go. But when this is off at the level of the material, we also have the ability to display just individual maps. And this might be a good way to test what maps are connected to what. So for example, I could select the reflection color and enable Show Shaded Material in Viewport on that map, not at the material level. So under this condition, we're seeing the reflection color bitmap applied to the diffuse color here. So that again is for testing purposes. I'll turn that back off again. and turn it back on again for the material. And you see once I selected that, the button turned itself off again. So now I'll turn it back on. All right, so for a basic or legacy material, then the Show Shaded Material in Viewport option will be fine. But if you've got a fancier material that's using fancy parameters or fancy OSL maps, then you'll need to be in realistic mode. And you can set realistic mode globally for all scene materials, once again from the Viewport menu here. But if you need to do that on an individual basis, select the material, go up to the Material Editor toolbar, and hold down the button Show Shaded Material in Viewport, and you get a flyout. From that flyout, choose the black icon, and that is Show Realistic Material in Viewport. And now if I assign this material to the floor, then I'll get a very high quality rendering. So I'll drag from the output of the physical material over onto the floor itself. And when that updates, we see we're getting a nice high quality result. If we click on this button again, it actually switches us back to Show Shaded Material. It doesn't turn Show Realistic off and Shaded off. It switches us back to Show Shaded. And if we click this button a second time, then it turns it off completely. So that takes a little bit getting used to. That's a little bit tricky. So again, for a fancy material that's using fancy parameters or fancy OSL nodes, we can't just be in Show Shaded Material in Viewport. It's not going to be good enough. We'll need to be in realistic mode. One final point about OSL maps. Realistic mode is very accurate, but it is much, much slower. In realistic mode, OSL maps have to be compiled. In shaded mode, OSL maps are baked. Let me explain that. An OSL map is actually a script that has to be converted to machine language and run in the viewport. The viewport currently relies on something called HLSL, or High Level Shading Language from Microsoft. It relies on that to actually do the hard work of rendering. So the OSL script has to be converted to HLSL, and unfortunately HLSL is the bottleneck. It's very, very slow. Compiling the OSL to HLSL could take a very long time or just fail completely, and you will see your viewport objects display a gray checker pattern instead of a surface. So in that case, you may have to use standard shading mode, which is inaccurate but much faster. Instead of compiling the OSL script and running it, the viewport displays a kind of dumbed down, baked version of that map. It pre-renders it at some specific size, and because the image it displays is inaccurate, it shouldn't be used for design decisions for procedural maps like a noise. And that's the complicated and convoluted world of material shading modes. You need to be in the appropriate mode depending upon what type of material or map you're using.